So I know the first slide said viruses, but this video is actually going to cover things that are not viruses, but other things that are acellular that can potentially still cause harm. So remember that acellular means that it's not made of cells, and viruses are acellular. But we're also going to talk about prions and viroids. So first, let's talk about prions. And remember, these are not viruses. We're just talking about them in the same chapter as viruses because they are acellular like viruses are. But prions are what we call proteinaceous infectious particles. And that proteinaceous just means that it is essentially a protein. But if you remember, proteins have a 3D shape to them. So they're not just like a string. Remember, they're made up of amino acids that are bonded together. But in order for a protein to work properly, it has to be bent and shaped in a certain way. And prions are these proteins that are misfolded. So we're going to jump down here. So these are proteins that are not folded the correct way. And this misfolding causes really major problems. Now, prions are even smaller than viruses because remember, a protein is a molecule. And molecules are even smaller than viruses. Viruses actually have proteins associated with them in the capsid and the spike protein sticking out of the envelope. Prions do not have nucleic acids. They don't have a genome. They don't have genetic information. They don't have DNA. They don't have RNA. They are literally just proteins, but proteins that have folded in a way that makes them dangerous. Now, the interesting thing is that this misfolding can be spontaneous, meaning that it can just happen, which is kind of terrifying. Prions can also be infectious, meaning that if one organism is infected with a prion, those prions can actually be transmitted to another organism. And the main way that this occurs is through ingesting nervous tissue, so primarily brains. So brain, nervous tissue. And it's ingesting or eating that can cause these prions to be transmitted from one organism to another. Now, I say that these prions are terrifying because they cannot be killed and there is no treatment. And we're going to talk a little bit more on the next slide what they do, but they are progressive, meaning that they get worse over time, and they are usually quickly progressive. So once the infection starts, the symptoms progress pretty quickly, and they are always fatal. So if you develop a prion disease, there is no cure, there is no treatment, you are going to die. Now, I don't mean to scare you. So prion diseases are very serious if you get it, but they are also fairly rare. So don't worry too much about getting a prion disease. The most well-known prions are these ones that cause fatal neurodegenerative diseases. And I honestly don't know if there are prions that do anything other than this, but these are the ones that I know of. So neurodegenerative, remember neuro means the nervous system. Especially the brain. And degenerative means that it's breaking down. So if we look at these pictures over here, so this is a normal human brain on probably a CT scan or an MRI. And then this is a brain that has this Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease here. And you can see that there are just parts of the brain that are, there are like these bigger gaps in the brain that shouldn't be there. And that's because these prions are essentially eating away at parts of the brain. So some examples of prion-related diseases. So we do have this Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease that we just mentioned here. Mad cow disease is probably one of the most well-known ones, and this was a big problem in Europe a couple of decades ago, where people eating the nervous tissue of cows or beef that was somehow infected with this prion were getting this mad cow disease, and they were dying from these prions. And mad cow disease is more specifically referred to as bovine spongiform encephalopathy. Encephalopathy means basically pathology of the brain, and it literally means cow spongy brain. Another example of a prion disease is something called Kuru, and this was not so much a problem now, but several decades ago in New Guinea, this was a growing problem. It was very common for people to eat the bodies of their deceased relatives and friends. And so this was a sort of kind of ritualistic cannibalism. So they were eating other people that had died. And more specifically, the women and children typically ate the brain of the deceased friend or family member. And they were coming down with this prion disease, this neurodegeneration that was fatal and killing them. Now, the men typically ate the muscle tissue of the deceased, and they were much less likely to get this disease and die. Prions can also affect other animals. So we mentioned mad cow disease, which obviously affects cows, but it can also affect things like deer, moose, elk. There are others that affect things like sheep and other livestock, etc., etc. And lastly, we're going to talk about viroids. And viroids are, remember, another acellular entity. So they are not made of cells. They're actually just made up of little circles of RNA. And remember that RNA is a molecule. So these viroids are also very small. They're smaller than viruses. They don't have a capsid like viruses. They don't have an envelope. They are literally just a little piece of RNA that is kind of floating around in the environment. Now, viroids, as far as we know, only infect plants. So they're not a direct threat to animals or humans, but they can cause crop loss. And so this could be a problem associated with the economy and feeding people. So kind of indirectly, they do still affect humans and other animals. Now, they do replicate within cells, but they don't manufacture proteins, and I don't think we know a lot about them.